Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Mulvihill, and I am the Executive Director for Humanities Kansas, and I want to welcome you to The Big Idea. The Big Idea is an online program intended to highlight and inspire fresh thinking in humanities scholarship, and you are in for a real treat today. Now, the first housekeeping duty and the only housekeeping duty that I have for you today is that we do welcome your questions and your comments. You can put your comments and your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A, whichever you prefer. Now, some of you who are returning attendees for the Big Idea programs know this, but each Big Idea actually begins with a short essay that is written by our guests that sort of explains their idea. What's your big idea? And so you can use that as the jumping off point to really think about today's conversation. And what we hope will happen is that combined with today's talk, as well as that written piece, you'll have the motivation to maybe talk about what you learned, what you're questioning, what you're thinking about with your friends, with your family, and really spark that conversation. So to begin, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Valerie Mendoza, who will introduce and interview our special guest. Dr. Mendoza is Director of Title III Strengthening Institutions Grant at Washburn University. She's a native Kansan and earned a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you very much, Valerie, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to you, our Joy Murphy, who is our guest today, talking about her big idea discourse for a better community. Joy is the Learning and Engagement Director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library Museum and Boyhood Home in Abilene. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So let's just jump right in. I want to talk about this essay, which I found really thought-provoking. So you talk specifically about museums creating, exhibiting, and exhibits and programming to minimize the risk of controversy. Like that's kind of the first instinct, right? But you go on to say that that's a missed opportunity. So can you give us a missed opportunity of discourse for a better community, right? So can you give us an example of minimizing the risk from an exhibit you worked on or visited, and talk about that missed opportunity, what might have been done differently?
Well, first of all, let me jump in and say that when I say, when I talk about, creating these opportunities for discourse, I am not advocating for people to go out and antagonize the public.
Right.
That is not what I'm advocating for. What I'll use as an example that I know that everyone can get access to pretty easily, and that is the Enola Gay exhibit from the 80s, which actually didn't become an exhibit until the 90s, the late 90s, early 2000s. But the Enola Gay, of course, was the plane that was used in World War II in Hiroshima. And back in the 80s, there was this grand idea to redisplay it and sort of talk about, what happened in Hiroshima. And needless to say, before anything ever came to fruition, there were already people up in arms about what was happening. Now, some of the things that they did right was that they tried to listen to those voices. They tried to listen to what the people who were, especially the people who were directly impacted by it, were saying. And there were people on all sides, right? There were Japanese Americans and Japanese who were saying, they wanted to display, the sort of the tragedy of it and sort of what happened to them. There were veterans who were saying, we want to display it, but we want it to be about, from our perspective. There were scientists who were, wanting to have these conversations about atomic energy and things like that. So, there were all types of voices out there, and they didn't immediately scrap this exhibit, once they started hearing all of these voices. What they said, the original idea was to host all of these panel discussions and, these programs to hear more about the community, which is a great idea. That is a great way to hear, to listen and have discourse in a positive way. Listen to what your community is saying. So they started off doing well. I think where they veered is that they tried to satisfy every voice to happiness, right? You can consider every voice. You can try to satisfy them in some way, but you also have to recognize that there is absolutely no way you can make everyone happy and be okay with that. And I think that's where they went off rails. They were trying to make everyone happy. And then there were these accusations of revisionist history and, really not telling everyone's story accurately and all of that. And so it wasn't until I think like 1999, early 2000s that the actual Enola Gay exhibit opened. And it was a much more watered down version of what was originally supposed to happen. And then they still upset people. And so, and I think that's something that as museum professionals, we have to think about the fact that, again, we cannot make everyone happy, but we can stand on the history. And so, so like I said, they got some things right, but not everything right. And so I think what they did, I don't know that they actually had these community forums, but I do know that they listened to the community. But I think that where they went wrong was trying to make everyone happy.
Yeah. Well, and I really like that example because it's an example of a nationally recognized museum that's also, working through these, these differing ideas, right? And like you said, you can't please everyone.
Right. And I think we have to recognize that it happens on every level, from the local community museum all the way up to a federal museum. It happens everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good to know. Makes me feel better. So you also observe that museums should be agents of change, right? And this might be a little bit provocative for some of us who, were trained back in the day, or, were trained to be objective and to quote unquote tell the truth. And it could also be a little provocative for museum goers who have come to expect that objectivity, right, in institutions they visit. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I don't intend to be provocative. But the first thing I would ask anyone when you're talking about, telling the truth, the first question I would ask you and ask you to ask yourself is, whose truth are you telling? Because, history has shown us, in particularly American history, has shown us that that anyone who was not a white male, their history was not necessarily recorded. Newspapers weren't printing, weren't printing articles about, amazing things that happened to anyone who wasn't mostly a white male. And so we have to recognize that even with the documents that we have, those documents may have been written with some bias, may have been created with some bias. So, always ask yourself, whose truth there is. And then I think that sometimes as museum professionals, we want to be objective, but we end up trying to be neutral. And so, which isn't the same thing, right? And so, I want us to make sure that in this terms of being objective, that what we look for in objectivity is to try to tell a full story, right? A full bodied story. And so recognizing that sometimes what we have is terms of documentation that is available to us that has been preserved is only from a one person's perspective. And so we have to take the opportunity to know that there may be some other people who who very much lived through this that have a completely different take on it. And so, considering that when we are developing exhibits, when we are developing programs, how do we take this full bodied approach to telling a complete story? And so, it may mean going out and trying to find some more information, do some deeper research, looking outside of where we would normally look for information in order to tell this story. So I think that as museum professionals, and again, I'm an educator, so my job to me is always to try to give the public more and more information, right, so that they can have this body of references to formulate an opinion, right? And I think that's how we do it, right? That we provide more information, not just this small amount of information that we've done. Do the deeper research, get bigger, think bigger about what we're doing. I don't know. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, well, I like that too, because it goes back to the example you gave earlier, right? And Enola Gay is that, the perspective of the veterans is going to be different from that of the Japanese who lived there, in Hiroshima, and going to be different from the perspective of the scientists. And, what you were mentioning too about it's not just the exhibit, but it's also the programming that goes, around the exhibit. And that offers us that chance to delve deeper into the subject, or broader into the subject, and give those different perspectives. So
absolutely, and that's a great point, right? We can layer in information. Everything doesn't have to be in the exhibit. We want good information in the exhibit because everybody's not going to come to your programs. But when you're creating things, I try very hard. We don't do this here at Eisenhower, but I've been at some museums who have done this. But I try very hard not to encourage us not to create things in a silo. So education and exhibits should be working together and talking about what we're doing so that we can very much layer in this information and provide support for what's in the exhibits and then what's happening in programs, so that we build this interest, first of all, but we build this full story.
Yeah, and that, your point about there being a difference between objectivity and neutrality, I love that. So, thank you. So being an agent of change, right, is not merely in terms of exhibits, as we've been talking about, but, as we've mentioned, you're an educator, and that goes along with it as well, right? And museums are particularly rich source of education for our schools and our youth, especially in rural areas, right? They just bring in students who might not be able to learn, things otherwise, or make it more, hands-on learning. So how do we approach sensitive topics with young people and create that space for discussion?
Well, one thing I am big about is letting the children lead, because children will tell us what they're prepared for, right? And I often find that adults are less willing to talk about things that children are much more open to talking about, right? Sometimes we let our own concerns and fears get in the way, when kids can have a very open discussion without really any animosity amongst themselves, or they can have the animosity, but they can have them and then say, okay, we've talked it through and we're fine. Whereas adults, sometimes we hold on to things. So I often say, let the kids lead the discussion and let them show you where they want to go with it. But also being honest, with what we tell them, and that doesn't mean we have to, browbeat them over the head with information. It just means that when they ask a question, give them an honest answer, give them the documentation that can back up whatever is there, whatever they're asking. Be honest with them. Be prepared for tough questions. I've been tongue tied in a presentation to kids where they've asked me something that I was not prepared for, but it's okay. You can answer a question without knowing all the answers, right? I once did a presentation at an elementary school during Black History Month, and a student asked me, how long have Black people had their rights? And I said, we're asking tough questions today, aren't we? And so, I answered the question with, it depends on who you ask, and it depends on what rights you have, or what rights you're referring to. And then said, let's talk about that. What rights are you talking about? What does this mean to you? What should that look like? And it just sparked a discussion and a conversation, where I didn't have to walk away. I didn't have to give them an answer. They were just happy to talk through the conversation. And so that's one way. I think that's really a good way. And that kind of leads me to my last thing, which is that you want to teach but not indoctrinate. So again, let them have the conversation. You don't have to put your own personal feelings into it. You don't have to tell them how to think. You don't want to tell them how to think. What you want to do is make the resources and the knowledge available for them to formulate their own opinions. And I feel like that is at pretty much all ages, K through 12.
Yeah. No, I love that. So my the history classes at my son's school just recently visited the Eisenhower, and one of the things that almost universally they talked about was the hands-on space where they got to see what soldiers carried, right, in their backpacks and things like that. And so I think that kind of speaks to what you're saying, right? Not just touching and feeling, but the objects, but this would have gone into what a soldier carried into a battle, or while they were hiking from one place to another. And it was that thought-provoking that you just mentioned. So
absolutely. And our foundation does our K-12 education. They do an excellent job with it. But that particular program, one way is also thinking about, like, as a soldier who might be going off to war, and you're packing your pack, what would you be thinking about? Because we want to see the humanity in people. Going back to the objective, being objective versus being neutral, I do think that sometimes as museum professionals, we are so busy being objective, trying to be objective, that we end up being neutral, but that we lose their humanity. We lose the humanity of the people that we're talking about. And so that's one way to tell a story, is to bring in the humanity of the people who lived it.
Yeah, and that's an excellent segue to a question we have from the audience about Civil War history. So they ask, when displaying Civil War history, including Union and Confederate history, is essential, including flags, uniforms, etc. But how do museums do so without receiving claims of racism?
Well, I mean, I think it certainly depends on how you're displaying them, right? I mean, I'm not a curator, so let me preface that. But it depends on how you're displaying them, what your panels say about these objects, and what what is the purpose of your display, and then also what education are you including with these exhibits and these displays. But you want to make sure that, again, that you are talking about a full history, recognizing that these flags mean certain different things to different people, and honoring that. I think it's okay. I believe that it's okay to honor that. It's okay to honor that, that these flags represented certain things, and that representation can be harmful to certain people. Some people see it as a sense of pride, but recognizing why it's harmful or why it's a sense of pride. You can put that out there, and to me, that's not neutral. That's being objective, while again, as I said, while keeping the humanity of the people that we are talking about.
Yeah. And then also kind of almost goes into, a big topic in museums today, right? Repatriation of objects, be it from colonized countries or from, Native Americans. Like I know the University of Kansas just hired somebody to work on repatriating a lot of the objects in their collection to, Native American tribes. And I read about various other, national institutions that are working on, around the world, really, working on sending objects back to countries that they had once colonized. So,
yeah, I used to work for the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and they play a big role in repatriation of Native American artifacts. And for them, it's very, it's I think that's part of the people's humanity, right? Is that the things mean different things to different people. And for, particularly the Seminole tribe, that's who I can speak to during that time. For them, the human remains, it's just, taking human remains is just disrespectful to them. It's a disruption of the spirit and the soul for them. And so while non-Native Americans may be looking at it from the we need to learn about them perspective, and scientists may be looking at it as if from the perspective of we want to know more about how they lived and how they survived, and natural stories and things like that. They all have their perspectives. For these people, this is these are their ancestors. This is their culture says you're giving them back to the earth, you're giving them back from where they came from, and you have disrupted that flow for them. And so we have to recognize that is personal for them and respect that.
Absolutely. So can you give us an example of programming or an exhibit where you think the institution got it right in terms of being an agent of change or providing space for controversy?
So yes, a place that I have not visited yet but is on my bucket list is the Whitney Plantation. I think that what they do there, they do very well. They talk about, first of all, in this country, oftentimes when we talk about, the institution of slavery, we talk about it only as people who were enslaved, right? The Whitney Plantation starts before enslavement. They go back, and they talk about the transatlantic slave trade itself. They talk about, that, the first African Americans to come to Louisiana were not enslaved. They talk about that because, we're talking when we move from the language of being slaves to enslaved, because they are people, first. They are people first, and we want to maintain that humanity. And I think the Whitney Plantation does a great job of that. They also recognize that, this building, this plantation, represents both this this tradition of wealth in this country and what was built off of it, but also talks more about the people who built the wealth. So, and they do it without vilifying the plantation owner. And to be fair, there are some people who have a problem with that. But that is not what the Whitney Plantation, that is not what they decided their interpretation was going to be about, and that's fine. And they do a good job of, very specifically humanizing enslaved people and telling their stories. So I think they do a very good job there.
Yeah, it sounds like they're giving that fuller picture of the context of the time. and everyone involved, but also this notion of place, right?
Mhm.
And Louisiana's very specific placement, literally in, in that slave trade, and the Mississippi River, and all those types of
Exactly.
things. Yeah. Now I want to go visit too.
It's on my bucket list.
The Whitney Plantation is outside of New Orleans, right?
Yes. Well, is it New Orleans or Baton Rouge? I think yeah, New Orleans. It's outside New Orleans.
All right. So talk to us a little bit about that fine line between provoking controversy versus challenging thinking.
Okay, so this is a conversation I have quite a bit actually. So no one is asking you to go out and like throw accusations at people or you know or provoke people. Like no one is asking anyone to do that. As a matter of fact, I hope you don't do that. And often we have, I say that here when we're talking about programs and exhibits and things like that. Say, I don't want people out in our front yard on our lawn with pitchforks and signs. No one's asking you to do that. What I think should happen is having again these broader discussions, right? Of telling these full stories so that people will think about the perspective that they have, right? We all have our own perspectives. We all have our own biases, um, based on who we come from, who we are, where we come from, all of that. And so the idea is to get people to think outside of their own box, think outside of their own bias. Um, I'll give an example here at the Eisenhower. When I first got here, I did a program. I found out that we had some papers from a man by the name of E. Frederick Morrow, who was the first African American to serve in what we now know as a presidential cabinet. It wasn't called a presidential cabinet when Eisenhower was there. It was, I think, just his administration, but or an advisory board, I think. But he was the first African American, and so he played this kind of large role in civil rights and the civil rights movement. And sort of, I don't know if you've seen that photograph where they're at the White House and it's President Eisenhower, but there's like A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King, and they're all in this photo, and several members of the administration. So Mr. Morrow's in that photo as well, but it was his work that allowed that meeting to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, Mr. Morrow published an autobiography when he was living, and one of the quotes in the autobiography is something along the lines of Eisenhower's resistance or his slow movement on civil rights, right? And so when we were writing the program, I put that quote into the marketing piece. And one of my coworkers was very much like, no, he was very, forward thinking on civil rights. And he was very, because of course we know, the Brown v. Board happened during the Eisenhower administration and Little Rock and all of that. But I said to him, but what does progress look like to people who should have been born with those rights? And he was like, oh, I didn't really think about it like that. And that's the conversation you want to have, right? You that's what you want people to do, is to think about their own, what they've accepted as truth. Think about their own biases. Yes, absolutely. President Eisenhower, made a pathway for civil rights to happen, right? He absolutely sent the National Guard into Little Rock and to Central High School so that, Little Rock 9 could go to school. These things absolutely happened. However, he could have just as easily signed his name to a document to make it happen without having to go through the Supreme Court, and don't get me wrong, there would have been other challenges, absolutely, we know that. But for people who voted for him and who were waiting for these civil rights, these movements to happen, it's very much within their right to say, yeah, I think he's moving a little slow, because it directly impacts them. But for people who thought that, but there were also people who thought he was moving too fast, so, but the idea is, how do we get people to think outside of their own personal biases and their own personal, what they think they know to be true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we have a comment in the chat that Andy says that the Kaufman Museum in North Newton, Kansas offers an exhibit sorting out race that provides many opportunities for discourse. So it sounds like there's a place nearby that people could visit that is doing what we're talking about.
Yeah, try to take a visit. That sounds good.
And yeah. And we also have a question. What if a museum does not plan for an exhibit to be controversial, but controversy erupts? We know this happens too. What are the first steps they should do to address the challenge?
So my first step, I always believe, is to listen to what people are saying, right? Because sometimes our instinct is always to defend what we did, right? And that's fine. I understand the instinct to defend yourself, especially if that wasn't what you intended. If whatever they're accusing of you of isn't what you intended. But I feel like your first step is to listen to what they're actually saying. And then your second step is to self-reflect. Look at your exhibit and say, hey, did we miss something here? Is there a chance for us to be better? And there's absolutely the opportunity to say to the community that you serve, we messed up. And we know we messed up, but we're going to try to fix it. And maybe you can fix it through your programming. Maybe you can fix it. Maybe it's just another panel in your exhibit. It could be as simple as that, but maybe it is, let's bring in some different voices in our programming and talk this through. Maybe it's creating a safe space, a forum where those community members can come and express their concerns or their discontent. Maybe it's a one-on-one conversation, but also recognizing that sometimes there are people who just want to be a loud voice. And so I know some people are going to have some concerns and some issues with this, but not every voice needs recognition. There are going to be some people who just want to be loud. And that's when I say, can you stand on your history? Can you stand on the history? Do you have proper documentation to show that this happened? Now, that's not to say that there isn't other reliable primary source documentation that's out there that you didn't think about. But, you can also say, this is what we have available to us, and so this is where we got this information from. But it's okay to hear and listen to the community that you serve and want to make it right with that community, while also recognizing that there are some people who just want to be loud. And I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Also, I just wanted to let everybody know we have a correction. The Sorting Out Race exhibit from the Kaufman Museum in North Newton is a traveling exhibit. So if people wanted to bring that to their institution, it sounds like they could, and the information is in the chat if anybody is interested in that. And then we also had another question. If you could comment on if you know anything about Charles Curtis, who was a first Native American to serve as U.S. Vice President and controversial Kansan.
I don't know who Charles Curtis is, unfortunately. I am almost 2 years in Kansas. I didn't start learning Kansas history till I moved here. I'm a native Floridian, so I don't know unfortunately, no, I don't know who he is, and so I can't comment.
All right, no worries. So let me ask you this, because this actually is a good segue from the previous question and talking about controversy and unknowingly provoking controversy, right? You mentioned in your essay the National Coalition Against Censorship as a great resource for folks. So can you tell us a little bit more about them and what they offer?
Yeah, so I ran across them doing a presentation for someone else. I was looking for some resources to help people develop, how to talk through controversy. And so I ran across them, and I think they're a good website. Something that they have for sure is a museum's best practices for handling controversy. And one of the things that they talk about is creating a commitment for free speech. It's like a statement. And several museums have them, or sorry, not several museums, several institutions have them. But that is something, having that strong commitment, having it in writing, can help you navigate the public sphere. But they have they have different resources depending on what you do for a living or who you are, if you're a parent or a teacher or a museum professional. But just things that can help you navigate controversy. They are about making sure that that not just free speech, but freedom to learn is available to everyone. And so I think they're an excellent resource for everyone to kind of find out that information. Ooh, did I lose you all?
It looks like we have lost Valerie.
Oh,
and she's
okay.
coming back. Okay.
Sorry, you lost me.
All right.
The joy of Zoom. So everybody feel free to put questions in the chat or the Q&A. Joy, I have one more for you. So I want to hear more about what you're doing at the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. So how have you gone about cultivating an interconnected and positive community experience in the last couple of years since you've been there? And you guys just reopened too, so a lot of us, myself included, have not been able to go and see all the renovations. So love to learn more about that.
So the thing here is that the Eisenhower Museum is in Abilene, Kansas, and they very much have a love. The people here very much have a love for the museum here, and so truthfully, I have not encountered too much difficulty with even bringing in new ideas and new thoughts. The people here have been okay with listening and hearing, different perspectives, and I just haven't had too much difficulty here. At a previous job, though, I did have. I'm from Florida, so that it's to give you some context. So I did have some controversy where people were just sort of like, we don't want to hear this, or we don't want this to be brought here, as if it didn't already exist. Different conversations. And so one of the things that I did was invite leaders in the community to give their input on programs that we were developing, like reaching out to them and saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing something like this. Who do I need to talk to? Am I getting this wrong? Is there some information? We had a history harvest because, at that time, our curator said that, she was a little, well, let me back up. There had been some conversation about the lack of African American history in our museum. So we were a system of 5 museums, and there wasn't much. There was, a few panels at one museum. There was, like half a panel at another. It just wasn't much. And our curator said that, one of the reasons was that she just didn't have much information. No one had collected it over the years, and she had a problem getting more information. And so we worked on cultivating a relationship with the African American community, period. And from that, cultivating that relationship, having programs that told their stories and their experiences with the local history museum, which had not really been done before, it built this sort of tentative relationship with the community, but one that we were happy about. And so we had a history harvest, and we invited members of the African American community to come and bring us their documents. And we said to them, you bring them, we will digitize them, we will give them back to you, and we will also give you a digital copy, so you have it for your records. And then I went to different churches in the community and sat in their church services and invited them and told them about this history harvest and said, you want us to tell your stories, but we have to have the documentation to tell your stories. And through that, we ended up getting massive amounts of documents about things we had nothing on, including, there had been an all-Black high school there that we knew about the high school, but we had no documents for it. We ended up with, one person who had gone there, but whose mother had also taught there. We had all of her documents and all of his documents. And it just really sparked this sense of community, which turned into an exhibit at one of the museums on an African American family who had been a pioneer in that community, and it just rolled from there. And I think that's how you develop those community relationships. Start with one person and say, hey, I'd love to do this. Where do I go? But to your original question here at the Eisenhower, I've really just been creating programs, and I listen to see if there's any controversy, but I just really haven't encountered much.
That's great. So one of our audience members said that one of the things that they've done in their space when people have questions or concerns that were not addressed in the exhibit, and we know that we need to address them, is to create new text when needed. And they call it, you asked, we answered.
I love that. I absolutely love it, because it means you're listening, and people want to feel like they're being heard, and you're doing that. That's excellent.
Yeah. So what programming do we have to look forward to at the Eisenhower?
Well, next week is our Evening at Ease program. We have that bi-monthly. And so we have an annual theme. We kind of work off an annual theme, and this year's theme is difficult decisions. So it's all things with sort of related to the Eisenhower administration, but things that may have been difficult for President Eisenhower to make, or things that are difficult in the impact of the decision, or even controversial. So next week we will have a conversation about the Suez Canal and how that decision came about, and Eisenhower telling a friend no, and all of that. So we'll be doing that next week. And then at the end of the month, oh man, I can't think of what we're doing. Our Lunch and Learn is on Thursdays at noon, on the last Thursday of the month at noon. Right now, off the top of my head, I can't tell you who it is, but those are that we have that every month. So they're free. We do a virtual, they're hybrid. So if you're in Kansas and nearby, please join us. If you are not in Kansas, or you're in Kansas and you're not so nearby, we also have the virtual component, and all of our programs are free. So you are welcome to join us. You don't even have to register.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this discussion. Julie,
you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much, Joy, and thank you, Valerie, for navigating that conversation. I know that a lot of us who work in the museum field with or around museums are really grateful for this insight. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today for coming to the Big Idea, and we're happy to have you join in today. Now, today's presentation supports a special project that HK is doing throughout the rest of this year, and we're partnering with 6 organizations across the state, and we're bringing in a Smithsonian traveling exhibition called Voices and Votes, Democracy in America. And this exhibit looks at just exactly what you think it would look at, the history of democracy in America. And so this project has just launched. The exhibit opened at the Boot Hill Museum in Dodge City earlier in March, and it will make its way across the state to Nicodemus, to Winfield, to Wichita and Ottawa and Belleville, until it ends in January of 2024. And we invited Joy to help us think about how we can talk about democracy with our audiences as well. And so we were grateful for her presentation to the 6 sites that are working on that project. And we're grateful for you joining us for this larger audience today. And for everyone out there who is watching this presentation, I encourage you to go online to humanitieskansas.org and see the tour of the exhibition so that you can schedule it into your plans in the next 6 or 7 months. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of the week.
Have a good evening or good afternoon.